Hi there, I'm your host McAuley Tucker, and you're listening to The McAuley Tucker Show, the podcast where I sit down with some of the most accomplished and fascinating individuals in the entertainment and business industry. From celebrities to industry leaders, our guests offer unique perspectives and inspiring stories that will educate and inform you. Join me as I sit down with my next guest to cover their humble beginnings, challenges they faced, as well as their accomplishments in life. You are bound to learn something new, so sit back and enjoy the interview. Today in the McAuley Tucker Show, we had the opportunity to interview Scott Ross, who is an American digital media executive with a career spanning 3 decades. In the 1980s, he led George Lucas's company, and he also is known for co-founding Digital Domain with James Cameron. We hope you really enjoy this interview. Scott, I think it's important to start at the beginning. That's what I like to do with all these interviews, is at the beginning. You sent me the book that you are writing, that you've actually just finished writing. It's out. We're going to link that. I want to start with specifically your mother. You've spoken about your mother and her influence on your life. And I really enjoyed what you said about her. You mentioned in your book that she's talked about making money versus making the world a better place. And it's obvious that her values around justice and truth have really, really, really shaped you. I wanted to ask, are there any moments where her advice, maybe a story or a lesson she's passed down, has helped you navigate your career, whether it be in Hollywood, especially facing tough decisions and dilemmas?
Well, unfortunately, my mom passed away when I was about 21 years old. So prior to my career in the movie business, I was sort of still in university when I was 20 when she passed away. Um, and maybe that's another reason why her life had such a big impact on mine, because as a 20-year-old kid, the loss of one's mother, particularly of the two parents, I was most close to her and actually not very close to my father. And the reason I wasn't so close to my father was because, I was 20 in 1971. And so in 1971, there was this thing called the generation gap. You might have heard of it. And there was the war in Vietnam. And I was this long-haired hippie, revolutionary, radical rock and roller. And my father was a veteran of World War II. And as a result, he and I sort of butted heads a lot. But my mother actually was, sorry, Dad, a lot brighter than my father was and a lot more progressive than my father was. So she and I were pretty close. And in some ways, sort of interesting, I have an older sister who's now 78. And my older sister remembers our childhood differently. She's 5 years my senior. She remembers being close to my father and my mother giving her a real hard time. I remember exactly the opposite. And that might have to do with I was a boy, she was a girl, etc. So my mother really didn't have a direct impact on my career, but she had a direct impact on how I valued life and how I looked at the world and my sense of right and wrong. Um, and my mother was, shall we say, very liberal for someone in the 1970s. She was sort of a feminist and she was very much against the war in Vietnam. My father, on the other hand, was not a feminist and was very supportive of the Vietnam War because, he fought in World War II and that's what men did. So the relationship that I had with my mother was very, very close and very, very unique. And, she taught me things like, what was really meaningful in life. She was never interested in making a lot of money. She was interested in making changes. She was really a true progressive back in the 1970s. And while she didn't go to college or university because she couldn't, because she was a child of the Great Depression, and as a result had to go to work, she could have easily gone to university and gone on to, great things. But because of her times and her position in the world, being a woman at that time, she was somewhat limited in the things that she was allowed to do. And she took that with noblesse oblige. She was not angry about it. She was a great mother, but she did go to work and she excelled at work. And had it been a different time, I really think she could have made a really big impact on the world because she was that smart.
Well, it sounds like she had not had a major impact on you from what you're telling me. Even though she might have not necessarily had an impact on your specific work in Hollywood, it sounds as if she's instilled in you perhaps this desire to be like her and dedicate yourself to your work. And I mean, reading your memoir, you clearly are very strong in your values and in your beliefs. I know earlier on in your life, you were actually involved in the music world and you've actually
Correct.
worked with a lot of musicians. I'm a big music guy. You can't see it, but I've got about 200, 300 some records in that corner over there. And you have said before, and I don't know if this is true, that you said if aliens ever invaded, you'd play a Love Supreme by John Coltrane to save us. I think that you said
Yeah,
that.
I,
You've
I
mentioned that
did say
before.
that. Good research there, McAuley.
Yeah, and I know I'd love to hear if you had stuck with music full time instead of going into film and visual effects. How do you think your life and career might have played out?
There was a seminal moment when I determined that I didn't want to continue to follow my musical aspirations. Um, uh, Back in Palo Alto in the 1970s, the musicians would hang out together. We were in our 20s. There was a coffee house that would take place Friday and Saturday nights at Stanford in Palo Alto. And so all the musicians would go to the coffee house, and each one of us would get to play. And um, one of the toughest songs, bebop songs, was a Charlie Parker tune called Donna Lee. And this kid gets up on the stage and calls Donna Lee in the key of D flat. And my mind blew. It's like, what are you talking about? I have to play an E flat because I'm playing a tenor. I've never played it in E flat. Where's the lead sheet? And I thought to myself, I don't want to grow up playing in like bar bands and ultimately be 45, 50 years old wearing a shiny black suit playing bar mitzvahs and weddings. And so it was at that moment that I made the decision that maybe following my career in music was not really valuable enough to me. And I determined at that point I would not be a professional musician. And what I would do is I would be involved in other media and medium that could, change the world and entertain people. And it just so happened it became film.
Well, it sounds as if your experience in music still was able to provide you, practical skills that could go into different careers. I mean, I've been career wise all over the board, doing journalism, working over a pharmacy counter, and you don't think those things are connected. But, as I've talked to people like you, things, from our past and are kind of all interconnected in some way, some form. I know in your younger years you worked at what's it called, a video store called One Pass Video in San Francisco. So you worked there for a little bit, and you were part of building, I believe, a 40-foot semi tractor trailer mobile TV studio, which is a
Well,
mouthful.
you did your research, Mr. Tucker. That is correct.
And it
I
was
mean,
groundbreaking at that time. And I mean, I
the,
was going to ask if you took that concept, reimagined it today with the technology we have, drones, live streaming, what would you think that studio would look like?
well, today things are so much smaller and so much easier in lots of ways, and the ability to be able to create video and or television is a lot more democratized than it was then. I wound up the name of the company was One Pass Video, and it was not it was a fairly well-known San Francisco video production and post-production house. And because of what I had done in the past, one of the things I was a sound guy and a cameraman for sports events like the Oakland A's and the San Francisco Giants and the San Francisco 49ers. So, when NBC or the away team came to Candlestick Park, we would wind up crewing it, and I would be doing, television. And in fact, when I went to undergraduate school, the majority of my work was in television and not in film. So it felt very, very comfortable there. Um, it was it was a great experience because I learned what was important, and I learned to work as a team because I would put like 18 people together for a remote, and I'd be sort of the crew chief, and I would organize it, and I really discovered my leadership skills back then. So it was it was funny. I used to come home And my then wife would say to me, "So who won, the Giants or the, whoever we were playing?" And I'd say, "Who played?" I don't even remember because the sports thing was not of interest to me. The interesting part of it was the technical stuff of putting it all together and working as a team. But I was never a jock, and I really didn't. I care a lot more about sports today than I did back then.
And with that job, again, you mentioned it helped you learn to manage teams. And of course, both me and you know that you have managed a lot of teams in your life. One thing that I found really fascinating about you was this one point. You landed a job at George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic after 70 plus interviews. And I do a lot of interviews. This would be my 60th sum, surprisingly. And that must have been wild, sitting down and having interviews with so many people. And you might have not necessarily been thinking about this, but were there any conversations in those interviews, maybe one with somebody totally outside the field that you were wanting to get into, that kind of surprised you, challenged you, made you go, huh, this is very interesting? Because again, it's you guys are sitting there to have an interview. You guys are probably going to have some small talk, but was there anything that kind of helped you in those conversations with those 70 plus interviews?
Well, first of all, let's go in the way back machine. So that took place somewhere in the mid 1980s.
Mhm.
And my 70 interviews at time was a group of 5 or 6 interviewing me. At times it was one-on-one. I had come from One Pass, which was a television production and post-production company, pretty well known in the Bay Area. And here I was interviewing for George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic. And so it was going from the minor leagues to playing for the New York Yankees, or nowadays the Los Angeles Dodgers. So I had stars in my eyes. And when I got there, I was just so taken by the possibility that I could work with the people that created Star Wars. So all of the conversations and discussions, I was just like a kid with big, bright eyes going, "Holy cow, I can't believe that I'm sitting here at Lucasfilm with the people that did Star Wars." Now, I saw Star Wars when I was like 26 years old in 1977, and it was a life-changing experience. So the concept that I would be working possibly for the company that did the visual effects for Star Wars, I floated in and floated out, all the time. And I didn't really care who I was talking to, whether it was Karen Dubé, the receptionist, or Dennis Murin, the most Academy awarded visual effects supervisor of all time. I was just blown away. I was like a kid. And I so wanted that job.
Mm.
And ultimately, after all these interviews, I was lucky enough to be chosen to be the guy to get it.
And you were, and such a wonderful opportunity it was. You mentioned Star Wars, amazing film. I actually had the opportunity to speak to somebody who was involved in the original Star Wars movie. I had no idea they were involved in this role, but his name was Ted Eccles, and he was running the team that was creating not the lightsaber that you hold, but the actual energy.
Beams. Yeah.
Yeah, the
So he
actual
was a
beams.
rotoscope animation person.
And it was a pure accident how they developed it. He told me the story behind it, and it was a pure accident, his team, that they were able to create what we have today. And it's a very powerful project. And I'm very happy that you had that experience. I know you mentioned, I believe it was in your book that you only, I believe, interacted with George once. I
Correct.
think it was after the fact. You were in a Mexican restaurant
Correct.
along those lines, and you kind of went over, and he didn't know your role, and but still, just that one interaction that must have been kind of the final piece in the puzzle, being able to have that.
So here I was, for all intents and purposes, the number 2 executive at Lucasfilm. There was one guy above me, Doug Norby, he was the president, but I was the second most powerful executive within Lucasfilm at that time.
Mm.
And I was responsible for 5 separate divisions. And my time there was incredibly successful, multiple Academy Awards, rejiggered the company from analog to digital. Um, it was heady times. I'm really proud of the work that I did there. And besides the guys and gals, actually only guys, unfortunately, that wound up getting the Oscars, I was one of the most important people in that company. So here I was, and I had had it shall we say, a little spat with my boss, the president, Doug Norby, who, by the way, was a finance guy who came in from another company. And he, in my opinion, was doing all of the wrong things. Each one of the divisions were losing money, and he was there to fix that. And because he was a finance guy, his way of fixing things was shutting things down, clamping things down, not allowing for expenditures, cutting capital resources. When I got there, I took a 180-degree different approach. And my approach was, let's get wings and fly. Let's look at new technologies. Let's embrace new ways of doing things. Let's tighten it all up. And we started making money. So I was really, really shocked when Doug Norby saw me as a threat. I think he saw that as I was taking over these various divisions and becoming more and more successful, that I might be able to interact with George, and that George might see me as the person who should really run Lucasfilm. But so to ensure that he didn't allow that to happen, Doug Norby, the president, my boss, kept me away from George. So I never met with George. I never saw George. I never spoke to George. Never. And I was there for a good period of time. And I had transitioned Industrial Light and Magic to the digital age. And I had turned it to be profitable, which it wasn't. And so Norby finally had enough of me, and he fired me for all intents and purposes. And so when I left the company, I was shocked because I had the support of all the employees, and my track record was stellar. And so when I ran into George at that point, I was unemployed. I felt like I was done wrong. I felt like my world had come to an end. Here I was in Marin County working in the film industry, very few choices. I was the leader of the pack. I had the job. All of my kids were in private school. My wife at the time did not work, and I was the sole, wage earner within the family. And so all of a sudden, what was a great world for me got turned totally upside down. And it got totally upside down, and I got blindsided because this fellow, Doug Norby, was threatened by me. And so I don't know what he was telling George, but I never had an audience with George. And so for me to run into George in that Mexican restaurant that night, after I was, sort of summarily fired and walked out off the premises, was a shocker to me. And I wanted to go over to him, and I wanted to tell him of how much I loved working at Lucasfilm, how much I learned, and at what an impact that company had made on me and the impact that I had made on the company. And so I walked over to George in this Mexican restaurant. He was there with his young daughter, Amanda. And I said, George, I just want to thank you for the opportunities I've had at Lucasfilm. And George looked at me quizzically before he took another bite of his burrito, and he said, and you are? Because he didn't know who I was. And that said it all for me. Here's a guy that I really admired, but had removed himself so much from the business that he was letting this Philistine, Doug Norby, try to run this company into the ground. And I was doing everything to try to lift the company up, to bring it into the digital age, that I was the one who was made out to be a bad guy. So I only met George once, unfortunately. And I feel that if Doug Norby had not been there, or if Doug Norby had been a different guy, that George and I would have got along famously, and that I would have been able to really help him do the things that he wanted to do.
I really appreciate you explaining that more in detail, and you hit a lot of points as you've spoken about before. He actually, I believe, Doug was let go or something that happened. I believe that's correct. Later
Correct.
on, and
He
it
was
must
actually let go only days after I was let go, only a week or so after I was let go.
wow.
Yeah.
That must have been, and I'm really sorry that that must have happened. I mean, I've experienced probably nothing like that before, but I've experienced career struggles, and specifically in your situation, that must have been one of the challengingest situations. Looking back at that, despite it being so hard, even in pain and agony and hard problem and situations like that, one can find gold, can find something that was helpful. Looking in that situation, how did that help you, it benefit you per se, even though it was such a blow? Are there any redeeming parts of such a horrible situation?
There's always redeeming parts of an awful situation, and it's really up to the individual to be able to see the light. Now, at the time, I was blinded by the light. I was angry and I was upset and I was scared. I had a family, I had three children. My wife didn't work. I was the sole earner. I was making a decent living. I was living in a nice home, and all of a sudden, things just fell apart. And it caught me on the wrong foot. I was really, really in bad shape. When I think back at it, there were a couple of great things that happened. First of all, I got to form Digital Domain as a result of that. I became an owner. I realized that my time at Industrial Light and Magic and Lucasfilm was actually valuable, not only to me, but more importantly to the workers that were there. I helped usher in a major transition in technology. When I got there, everything was analog and photochemical. And now we look back, and it was really through the efforts of myself and Dennis Murin and Scott Squires and Spaz and other people that leveraged Industrial Light and Magic to become a digital powerhouse. And I'm proud of that. So everything in the rearview mirror looks really rosy. At the moment, I was scared to death. I had a mortgage, I had two cars, I had kids that were in school, I had a wife that didn't work, and now all of a sudden I was out of a job. And the job that I had was so unique that there was no finding another job like that in the Bay Area, and probably not, and it turns out there wasn't an ability for me to find a job that I could qualify for and that I would be hired for in Southern California, which ultimately led me to the realization that if I'm going to survive, I need to start my own company.
And that's when digital domain comes into play. And
Correct.
that has impacted a lot of the films that we all know and love. And you worked with, of course, James Cameron and Stan Winston. And it wasn't just a business, it was a huge leap into the unknown, as you've talked about. There was a guy by the name of Jeffrey. You directed him during that company, and he praised your ability specifically within digital domain to turn that small kind of smart idea into a powerhouse, which of course you did. And with today's financial, pressures on VFX, how do you think a new studio, much like what you guys were doing back then, can push the limits of technology while still managing tight budgets?
So I'm gonna be the guy with the hood over his head and the scythe, right? I'm gonna be the harbinger of death. So I've seen visual effects companies and visual effects capabilities change over my last 35-year career, right? The 35 years that I first started in it. And it moved from sort of photochemical and models and miniatures to digital and computer generated imagery. And now it moved to uh, away from green screen, and now there's like sound stages with rear projection, and so the technology has changed. But in the changing of the technology, it has been evolutionary. Okay, so it evolved, but we're on the cusp of revolution, and the cusp of revolution is that um, we see generative artificial intelligence. And AI, as we're seeing it grow and as we're seeing it expand really quickly, um, I predict that within the next 3 years, 70% of the people in the visual effects industry will be unemployed.
Mm. It's really
So
crazy.
I don't think that there's really, if my kids are grown, but if my grandson was, one of them was 20 years old, he's not, he's 12, and said, Grandpa, what I really want to do is work in the visual effects industry, and I'm going to go to school and I'm going to study, I would do everything in my power to convince him not to do that.
It's a very challenging reality with artificial intelligence. I was talking with my dad about that downstairs. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what I should do per se. Many have told me, McAuley, stop consuming media made by artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's going to do anything. I kind of
Well,
find
Macaulay,
myself,
you're
yeah,
you're not in control of that.
yeah,
You're
I'm
you're
not.
just one person, right? And so
Exactly.
you're not going to make a difference by boycotting artificial intelligent created media. I mean, that's a joke.
Yeah.
You're not even a drop in the bucket. So um, it'll be a brave new world, and one has to think about creating content as a content creator using the tools that are available, which would include artificial intelligence and the ability to be able to get those stories out and figure out a way to be compensated for that. But the last thing I would suggest is to join a visual effects studio. I think in 3 to 5 years, they will be gone.
It's very true. Artificial intelligence is just taking over. I mean, writing, like I do writing on the side, I do freelance work. And so just like losing that, it's going to be challenging, but we have to adapt. I mean, and you're seeing it, we're all seeing it. With going back to digital domain, with VFX, you've worked with people, you had a team. I would love to hear specifically what is a common misconception that one may have of somebody who's working in this industry, perhaps the people that you've worked with who are maybe looked upon as high and mighty. What's one misconception that many people, like maybe I have, of these individuals, because you've worked closely with them?
I think the first statement that you made is somewhat of a misconception, is that they're looked at as high and mighty. All one has to do is look at the credits on a visual effects heavy film, and the visual effects team comes after the caterers. They're literally at the end of the credit roll. So, or when Bill Westerhoff wound up winning the Academy Award for Life of Pi, and he gets on the stage for the Academy Awards and he starts to talk, they played the theme of Jaws and he was rushed off the stage.
Mm,
So, unfortunately, the visual effects industry is not seen, and it's outrageous that it's not, is not seen within the filmmaking community and Hollywood, for example, as creative people. They're seen as technical people, which couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. And as a result, they're the tail that wags the dog. They're literally at the wrong end of the process. They're not given the credits they're given. They're not given the compensation that they should be given. They're not given the respect that they should be given. And, most of Hollywood thinks of them as, yeah, those weird visual effects guys, yeah, we work with them. So it's not like, I'll give you a good example. God, what was the name of that film in outer space with George Clooney
oh,
and
Gravity.
Gravity? Okay, so you look at Gravity, and the star of Gravity, in my opinion, was the visual effects in that film. It was definitely not Clooney and what's her name? What's her name?
Sandra Bullock.
Sandra Bullock.
Yeah, yeah.
It was definitely not the two of them. People did not go to that film to see Sandra Bullock in a suit or George Clooney floating around in space. The two main components of the film that were excellent was the screenplay, which was really quite daring and wonderful, and the visual effects that created the imagery. So I believe it was Framestore, a British company, did the visual effects for Gravity. They probably broke even and maybe even made a little bit of money. Sandra Bullock made $70 million.
Mm.
There's something rotten in the state of Denmark. So the people that actually made the film, made the compelling part of the film, really hung their butts out on the line to get this stuff done, come up with new concepts, new ways to be able to produce this and create the imagery. They got their salary, and I think they might have won an Academy Award. I don't know. But Sandra Bullock, who was a movie star, she wound up making a ton of money. And so
Mm.
there's something rotten in the state of Hollywood that happens, and it's still happening today. I mean,
How
what
do
would
yeah.
what would Avatar be like without the work that the folks in New Zealand do? Weta. it would be a bad love story, right? But
Right.
if you look at it, it's all about the Navi. It's all about the animation. It's all about the technology. It's all about the performance. It's that stuff that makes it exciting, which makes it the number one and number three highest grossing pictures of all time.
Wow, that's such a really powerful point that you made, specifically with Gravity. I mean, I watched, like me and my brother, we watched it specifically. I mean, as you mentioned, because it was just like, this is eye-opening.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like this. And this might be kind of an odd question. Well, maybe that you've been asked before. How do you think it should look, and how can we make it look that way? What should we do with this? What should
Well,
people
I,
do?
I think at this point in time, it's too late. I think that
Mm,
as they say, they screwed the pooch. It's over. It cannot be fixed. Back
wow.
in the day, in the 90s and the 2000s, and even in the 80s, I was a big proponent of a major trade association where everybody has a trade. Pepsi and Coke have a trade association, and they work together, even though they're major competitors. So I always believed there should be a visual effects trade association, and that trade association would have a lot of power and a lot of political clout, and they would have the ability to change the gestalt of what the visual effects industry looked like. But that never happened. And it never happened because all of the visual effects companies were so wary of each other and so concerned about who the competition was that they could never sit around a table and look at each other like mature individuals and say, listen, we're all getting screwed here. How about we fund a trade association that fights on our behalf? They never could do it. And let me tell
Mhm.
you, I tried for 20 years, but it could never happen. And at this point, it's too late. And I say it's too late for two reasons. One is some of the major visual effects companies, ILM in particular, are owned by the studios. So the studios have no interest in a visual effects company having clout. They just want them to be the whipping boys and girls,
Mhm.
right? The second thing is that as we're seeing the advent, and we talked a little about it, as we're seeing the advent of artificial intelligence, that industry is going to start to go away. So it's too late. Unfortunately, they should have heeded what we were talking about 15 years ago, and maybe the world would have been different for the last 15 years, but they couldn't get their act together. Everybody was so afraid of what the other visual effects facility was doing, with their competition. They were going to steal people. That was that very immature, short-sighted look at what their industry was. They couldn't have an industry association. And I think at this point, it's too late.
Wow. That's a sad reality. I mean, I have not been in the VFX industry, but I can hear the pain through what you're saying. And I fear with that for journalism. You know, I always write articles and I think, from affordability perspective alone, it's probably better to have a machine. But from a humanistic perspective, it's better to have me write it. And so I sit here constantly, like as you mentioned, thinking about this. And it's I don't know what's going to happen, but whatever's going to happen, I'm just going to have to push through and find a way to adapt as you have throughout your life through challenges you've adapt. And I guess, kind of to switch the mood from a subject of this sadness, what I found really fascinating about you, Scott, throughout your book is the fact that you are a little prankster sometimes. You played a couple
Of
pranks
course.
before. And
Yep.
I wanted to hear what was the boldest prank you've ever pulled? Or again, like
Well, I can't tell you that on the air, but I can tell you one of the boldest pranks that I ever pulled. So, the producer of Titanic was a fellow by the name of John Landau. And John recently passed away. May he rest in peace. John came up through the ranks of the studio. He was an executive at Paramount, I believe, then 20th Century Fox, and then ultimately became Jim Cameron's producing partner. Um, Interestingly enough, as things would have it, because that's the way my life has been, his older brother was my friend at university. And so when I first met John, he was 9 years old. And I met him because his older brother and my other friend wound up getting married, and the older brother and my other friend Laura wound up having this event, their wedding reception, of which I was party to, and I wound up going to the reception, and John was 9 years old. And interestingly enough, it's just bizarre. This is bizarre. When John was 9 years old at that wedding, I was 19 or something. He comes over to me and he dares me to eat a flower that was placed in my salad, right? And so this 9-year-old kid, he's like, everybody else has a flower in their salad. You should really eat the flower in your salad. I said, well, I'm not going to eat a flower. He said, I dare you. 9-year-old kid, little snot-nosed kid. And so I said, okay. And I bite into it. And I didn't realize that he had taken the flower from another area in the garden that had been sprayed with like some DDT or something. And my mouth burnt on fire. And he thought it was the funniest thing. 9-year-old kid, right? Now we fast forward, and John is Jim Cameron's partner. And of course, at this time, he is probably in his 50s. So I've known this guy not well, we had lost touch and his brother and I had lost touch from university, but I knew of him when he was 9 years old. So we have a history. And so now when we're working together on Titanic, I'm pushing him, he's pushing me. And while it's all generally in good spirit, there's a lot of zeros at the end of it, right? There,
Yeah.
and so it's tough. And so one day, John decides, and he's a prankster too. John decides to send me a present. And we wrap Titanic. And after all the fighting and pushing and shoving, and at times it became, really difficult, he sends me this present in a blue box, and I'm forgetting the name of the retailer, but a very high-end retailer that deals in glassware, right? And
Right.
it's about so big and so wide, has a big bow on the top of it, and it shows up, and it's from John, and he says, thank you, Scott, for all of the work that you and your people put through in Titanic. What a great success, and we couldn't have done it without you. Love, your friend John. And I pick it up and I shake it, and I hear that it's all broken inside. Now, knowing John like I know him, he didn't, oh, it was Tiffany's. He didn't go to Tiffany's. He didn't buy this beautiful glass, whatever, punch bowl or whatever it is. He got the box. He took a piece of glass, or he had his assistant smash it into smithereens and put it in the box so that when I opened it, it would be smashed and ha 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 ha. Well, I know John well enough to know that's probably what he did. So I say to my secretary at the time, my assistant Sylvia, I said, Sylvia, do me a favor and call Landau at his office and tell him that your boss Scott received the gift and that he was very, very excited about it and didn't wanted to thank him profusely, but unfortunately he can't thank you right now because he's in the hospital. Because when he put his hand into the box, it severed his artery on his wrist, and we had to rush him to the hospital, and he's bleeding out. We're hoping he will survive.
Oh my goodness. Oh my
Yeah, so
goodness.
that's the kind of stuff we used to pull.
You could write a whole book about that. You
Oh,
could write a
yeah.
whole, my word. Well, that's the one thing I really enjoyed about my research on you, Scott. There it is. There's the book. I love that book. I would recommend everybody listening in to get that. Well, Scott, you have had an amazing life, and again, there's a lot of challenges that you've faced. The final question I may ask is, what is the future like for you right now? Any fun projects? I mean, you recently released your book. What are you excited for this year in 2025?
That's a big question. One of the things that I always wanted to do, and I always felt that I had the capability and the creativity, is to produce films that I developed. So I have about 5 films that I've developed and one television show that I've developed. And one of them is, well, all of them have nothing to do with monsters. There is no spaceships, there's no monsters, there's none of that. They're projects that I thought were meaningful. And so one of the projects that I have is a project called Ping Pong, and it's the somewhat true story of the American ping pong team being invited to China in 1971 and the bad news bears crazy crap that happens as a result of it. And so I'm working together with the woman who heads up the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and she and I are producing that, and we're working with writers to further develop it. And probably that will be one of the first projects that I can produce beyond the projects I produced in the past that come to the screen. But I have about 5 projects that I'm working on and in various stages of developments. And also I've decided that I'm going to be a jazz musician again. So
Really?
yeah, so I've been as you whoa, I knocked the microphone. Sorry, I'm not an audio guy anymore.
No worries.
So, you can see, my instrument of choice, and I'm taking lessons and I'm reinventing my sensibilities towards jazz music. And so I'm doing a lot of that. And then I've stupidly taken up the game of golf, which is I'm terrible at, but I love it.